Good afternoon, everybody. Sounds like Bud is having a technology issue. Let me introduce Sean to you and get him started. Sean is a member of the Improving Toronto team specializing in SAP and SAP analytics. His expertise encompasses data warehousing, reporting, and analytics, as well as planning and legal consolidation processes. Throughout his career, Sean has collaborated with organizations across North America providing education on SAP technology, developing solution roadmaps, and designing effective analytic solutions. In his free time, Sean enjoys spending time with his family and friends, hiking with his dogs, while also tending to his small hobby farm. Before we get started, I want to bring attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom interface. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll bring to Sean's attention any questions that you post in there. Now I'm going to give the floor to Sean Antonello.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you everybody for spending part of your Friday with me and sharing that time. Yeah, we're here today to talk about self-service and data independence in an SAP world. And this is really part of, a series of talks, a bit of a highlight here. We're talking about our focus on data independence. In case you missed it, this series started way back actually in October, on October 1st, with Devlin Lyles' keynote on how technology is holding back business value. It then streamed down to a few other keynotes. Rich McGraw talked about how to tell if your data platform is actually modern. And we're continuing today. There's been a few other sessions this week. And so we're talking specifically about, our platform in SAP and in SAP world. If you've missed it, by all means, you can go back and watch, and I would encourage you to do that. And next week, there's going to be a few talks around AI. So I would encourage you to go and register for those sessions. So today we're really going to talk about data independence. And I think it's important that we start by describing or defining what that means. We'll talk about factors that really impact the ability to have independence when it comes to data and reporting on that data. And then we'll get into technology and how SAP and SAP Datasphere is helping solve those problems and support data independence. I'll be clear, it's not something that ideally happens overnight. It's obviously a journey, but it's an exciting journey, and we're excited to be part of it. I did a talk a few months ago, and I started with the same statistic, and I like this really just to sort of, anchor conversation. If you read it, less than 44% of organizations that were polled, say that they're obtaining value from their existing reporting and analytics. Okay, and that was from a Gartner summit back in 2023, so relatively current. And it's sort of a shocking number. So less than half, of organizations polled say that they're getting value from the reporting, especially when we live in an era where data really is the new currency, right? Data is everything. We've been collecting data. Data exists around organizations. But really, organizations that can harness, and the power of that data can gain a competitive edge. But with that power comes responsibility, and a lot of organizations struggle. They struggle with data silos. So we've got multiple systems housing different data sets and trying to bring that data together. Integration issues, not even just by bringing the data together, but connecting to the data, putting it somewhere where it's actually reportable. And just really complexity. There's a lot of complexity when you're talking about large volumes of data and how you bring that data together in a fashion that will add business value. So it really does beg the question, if the data exists, why aren't we seeing the value? Okay, and I think that honestly, this comes from a bit of a lack of data independence and ability for users to find data and actually do what they want with that data. So if users aren't really getting the reporting that they need, it means a couple things. One is the supporting data, not in a usable format. Is it that the user just isn't aware of where the data lives or exists? Or is there just a real reliance on IT to bring this data together and make it accessible for users? Oftentimes that means you put a request in the queue and you wait. A lot of organizations, you can't wait, right? You need the data, you need to report on the data. And so that means getting creative and looking for ways to bring data together and do reporting on it. Um, when we talk about data independence, right, the first thing that comes to mind is self-service, right? And how are we more self-serving in terms of access to data? And that's part of it, but it's actually a lot more than that. It really stems from the ability to, in an organization, to access the data, to manipulate the data, and not be constrained by the source. So where the data actually lives. Okay, and it could be our SAP ERP data, it could be a supplementary SAP system, it could be a non-SAP system, and really it could be cloud or on-premise. The world has evolved, data has evolved, but certainly our tactics to deal with it haven't really kept pace. If we don't sort of have data independence, you'll sort of see here that people will lack agility, right? It's harder to adapt to business needs and changing business needs. It's harder to innovate, really to experiment and look at data and new data sources and run analytics on it. And we've got a cost perspective here. It's not efficient, right? It's not efficient if you've got multiple users trying to tap into the same data sets, wrangle data, and rely on a lot of manual processes, as opposed to really sort of working on the value add activities. Okay, and this is something that we see a lot in the SAP world. It's paramount. Most organizations struggle with data and true data independence, and how they put this together. So if we know what data independence is, what are the main challenges that really prevent users from achieving true data independence? In a traditional SAP shop, that's a customer running SAP ERP, perhaps some other SAP systems. There's a struggle here, and it really is a high dependence on IT to support data and reporting requirements. Okay, and that just comes from a few factors. One, the data is complex. If you're trying to tap into ERP to find specific data, it's not easy to do. SAP data is very connected. There's a lot of metadata that joins data together. And there's a lot of security and governance processes built around SAP data and just accessing and working with that data in general, which makes it very difficult, for organizations to sort of achieve the goal of becoming more independent when it comes to data and access of that data. Organizations that don't have data independence, I mean, obviously, it's just sort of what we talked about on the previous slide. What are the outcomes of that? Inconsistent insights, right? Different teams, different members of the same team might be relying on different data sources. They might be producing reports that have the same information, but actual different results. Slower decision making. We're spending time putting this information together and reconciling the data, again, not spending time on value add activities and using the data. Oftentimes, by the time the data is collated, put together, organized, it's historical, it's out of date, right? And you're looking for fresher data. And you've got increased costs. You're now maintaining different systems that organizations or users may throw on top. It becomes expensive, it becomes inefficient, and sort of not a sustainable fact on a go-forward basis. In an SAP world, we often see our ERP data, but there's a wealth of operational data that users want to bring together and join and look at in concert with their SAP data. It's very difficult. It's difficult for them to bring the data together. And like I said, it really does rely on IT, to sort of help solve those issues, okay, and bring the data together. And definitely not typically in a very timely or efficient manner. So we talk about sort of factors that impact it. Ultimately, data complexity and data volume, those would be top of the list. We're talking about data that comes from multiple sources. it's definitely not easy to find, it's not easy to locate, and it's not easy to join that data, right? If you're pulling data from ERP directly, the semantic tagging isn't always there, so you might be looking at things that fields that don't necessarily make sense from a business user's perspective, which obviously makes it even more difficult, to sort of achieve the desired independent data access. We lack real-time data, right? So often we're pulling historical data, or it's being staged in a system like BW. It is not real time, and so we're always sort of looking for newer, fresher, and greater information. It's highly customized in an SAP world. Very often we don't have what would be called clean core. We've got highly customized data sets, data processes, and it really does warrant the need for IT to help solve the data problem. But as you can imagine, from a business perspective, IT may not have the semantic understanding of what a user is actually looking for, and you end up in a little bit of a game of cat and mouse, right? Here's the data, it's not quite what we need. Now we're going back and continuing to sort of tweak. Sort of goes into this bullet point, technical knowledge versus business terms, not always easily apparent. And there's really a desire to integrate with external data sources. The diagram on the right is pretty busy. What it's sort of meant to represent, and you sort of look at the functional areas around HR, finance, marketing, procurement, that might be data that lives in our SAP ERP system. But cloud transformation has really compounded the issue of data access and finding and accessing data. So organizations really are extracting data and trying to recreate the context. So how do I take data that has operationally lives in a Google, hyperscaler, and join that so that it aligns with my supply chain data? It's building or rebuilding the data context, which is obviously not an efficient way of doing it. And technology has advanced over time. It's made it faster. It's made it cheaper to procure more cloud solutions. But it's harder for us now to manage that data at scale, to bring that data together, to join it, to make it so that we can access it and report on it in sort of an easy and independent fashion. So we'll say that data and technology has advanced, but our ability to bring the data together hasn't kept pace. Okay, and that's sort of obviously a very large contributing factor to how and why users sort of aren't independent in their use of data. So if we flip and just talk a bit about what SAP Datasphere is, we're then going to sort of pivot and talk about how we're going to be able to look at achieving that goal of data independence through the use of Datasphere. When we talk about Datasphere, obviously we're talking about data fabric, and this is a term that is used, a lot. At the bottom, we've got our data sources. At the top, we've got our data consumers. But there's a whole bunch of processes that exist or take place, within it. And the best way to sort of drive or achieve our data independence is really through a modern data platform. It's not moving the data around and trying to reconstruct that context. It's really creating a business data fabric architecture. And I'm sort of saying this in a slow fashion because we talk about data fabric, but we're really sort of talking about a business data fabric. And there's a nuance here. What makes it different from sort of a standard data fabric is it keeps that business context and logic intact. Okay, so it's going to allow you to leverage things like prepackaged connectors. So connectors that live in Datasphere that you can tap into your SAP systems directly. You can tap into non-SAP systems and look at bringing that data together. Accelerators. So, improving offers accelerators that live inside a Datasphere environment when it comes to things like financial reporting, planning. there's a ton of opportunity here to sort of leverage that content so that you're sort of not starting out of the box. Instead, you're starting with a model, feeding data into it, and allowing users to consume data out on the other side. And really, you think about the data ingestion process all the way through to user data access. These are sort of the elements we're going to hone in on to really sort of talk about how, Datasphere on its own can help support data independence when it comes to that data fabric. So if we sort of talk about the structure of how Datasphere would be architected, bottom here, obviously, we're looking at our data sources, whether it be SAP or non-SAP data. It could be from third-party applications, it could be structured, it could be unstructured, it could live in a relational database. The idea is we've got these data sources, we understand where these data sources live. What we want to do is really look at how Datasphere that sits inside of our business technology platform is going to sort of surround it with security, access control, and data availability, but give us the ability to, at the end of the day, allow data consumers to, bring that data in for reporting, analytics, planning purposes, data science. Really doesn't matter. The concept here is how do we find that data? How do we govern, join, and bring that data into a fashion where a user, an end user, is going to be able to sort of self-serve and leverage that information. So the idea here, right, it's going to provide a capability from data ingestion all the way through to self-service. The concept and Datasphere, formerly known as Data Warehouse Cloud, really is cloud native. So big leap from an SAP perspective, built from the ground up in terms of true data warehousing and a data fabric, built in the cloud for the cloud. But it really is going to give organizations the ability to connect, manage, and share that data, whether it's SAP data, whether it is non-SAP data, and bring it together. And if we look at each of those individual layers, so our data ingestion, we've got the ability to replicate data. So we can bring our SAP data in, we can keep our business context associated to that data. So all of those data relationships and use a replication flow to push it out somewhere to a hyperscaler, bring the data, in a fashion that is going to keep those relationships and keep an SAP customer compliant. SAP doesn't like from a compliance perspective with your licenses when users are just taking data out and throwing it into another system, a non-SAP system. Using Datasphere, if the end goal is to move the data somewhere else, you can sort of keep those relationships intact. But you could also federate the data, right? So create real time in a remote source. You're not sort of, physically bringing the data in. You could real time ingest the data so that you've got the data persisted in the system, again, giving users access to it. Governance, something that's going to be hugely important from an IT and an oversight perspective. Obviously, making sure that data quality, security, and compliance is maintained through the life cycle. And life cycle is important here because there may be times where data is being brought in and looked at and used, but as business needs change, perhaps business requirements change. Why are we still bringing this data in? Is this data being used? So it's going to allow us to audit what's being used and determine whether we're keeping it as hot, warm, or cold data, and or whether or not we're going to continue to invest in it. Apply a catalog where users are going to be able to look and search for data using context and their own business semantic terms that they understand what specifically they're looking for. And that gets us into the sort of processing and persistency layering, right? That it could be warehousing. We've got a knowledge graph, which we'll talk about in a bit, that's going to sort of give a bit more context to the data and how the data is related. We're going to orchestrate that data. So this is really where, a traditional data transformation and modeling, filtering, bringing the data into a format that can be used. And that data discovery and self-service data access that you see above is really where a business user gets involved. In a typical business warehouse world in SAP existence, those aspects don't really exist. It's IT pointing and saying, here's the model, here's the report that sits on it. You can leverage it. A lot of the concept has shifted here, that there is a relationship between what IT would typically own and now what business users are able to own, that they can go in, access through business content network, find the data that they're looking for, and start bringing that data together for consumption in any sort of aspect that we talked about. Another piece to sort of call out here, in a very unique move, SAP sort of recognized that there are other tools that exist in this marketplace that would provide value, things that perhaps SAP and Datasphere don't do natively, or perhaps as well. And so they've partnered sort of with an open ecosystem here, really kind of looking at solutions that are tailored or fit, and provide specific value. And so if we sort of talk through these solutions, we've got Calibra, and it is really concentrated and focused on data governance, and data stewardship. This platform, typically will complement Datasphere by really kind of providing data catalog, lineage tracking, compliance features. So it's a third-party solution, but there is a definite clear path and value that Calibra brings in a Datasphere environment. Confluent, same thing, right? So if Kafka or real-time or streaming data, this is where SAP is saying, great, let's leverage this. There are opportunities that we can leverage to have that streaming or event-driven data brought into Datasphere, and work in concert with Confluent. So again, not against, but there are valid use cases and why Confluent makes sense. Data robot, really around machine learning and predictive analytics. So things that perhaps Datasphere on its own isn't, best suited for at this point in time. We know that there are reasons that Data Robot and Databricks, as an example, exist in the ecosystem. So the idea here is natively connect to those, allow the data to be shared between, and obviously we're going to enhance what we're able to do from an end user perspective. And last but not least, on the Google Cloud side, it's really around their infrastructure, scalability, and service. Google has tools, again, for machine learning, and the idea here is a much more open ecosystem around. And the idea, I think these partnerships are going to continue to grow, but what we've got here is a very solid foundation, and access to data in different formats and manners that we wouldn't have just in a native SAP world. All right, so we've sort of laid the foundation, right? What is Datasphere? What is data independence? How do we bring those two elements together? And so what I want to focus on here is, how does Datasphere support data independence? And we're going to look at this through some of the features of the system and sort of want to make it clear this is not the entire capability of Datasphere. It is extremely robust. I could spend hours talking about its capabilities and showing its capabilities. What we wanted to do here was really pinpoint certain aspects and talk about how Datasphere supports the notion of data independence. So data connectivity and business context. I've talked about this a few times already, but obviously, an SAP solution is designed to be best when it works with SAP systems and SAP data. And again, that's relative to the fact that it understands the underlying data context and data relationships. So you can imagine in the SAP world that you've got customer data, you've got sales data. In an SAP ERP system, that data is connected. A customer, would be involved in one or many sales orders. Those sales orders would have, different elements, a product, a service, a price, a cost, that could be related or is related to a customer record. That relationship, if you take that information outside of SAP, is broken. It doesn't exist. And that's where a lot of organizations spend time trying to rebuild that data context. In an SAP world, in a Datasphere world, the ability to connect to that data leaves that metadata and data intact with prepackaged connectors. So it's a matter of finding the connector that you're looking for, pointing to the data, and starting to bring the data in. And whether it's on premise, whether it's cloud, real time, imported, it's going to enable you to make those decisions, connect to it, leverage open connectors for things that are non-SAP related, and have the ability to bring that information in and together. The concept here is the same. It's going to ensure governance, sort of cradle to grave in terms of how we're connecting to that data, how we're bringing the data in, how we're then going to sort of use that data and model that data on a go forward basis. When we talk data access, I think it's important to talk about the different ways that Datasphere can connect. To the left, obviously, you're going to see different types of data sources, structured, unstructured, streaming data. So again, through that confluent or event-driven information. And you'll see that through the business data fabric, there's the idea of physical storage or virtual access and being able to make that decision based off of the data, what the user wants to do with the data, how timely they want the data to be. So you can federate across the access across all of your data. You can replicate, store what you want, or combine both of those approaches. So you've got a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of how you sort of bring in the data. Virtualization, it's going to enable real-time federated access. And that's not just going to be to SAP data. I mean, that could be to non-SAP sources as well. That data is going to be left in the source, not moved, not duplicated, not replicated. And it's only going to be accessed remotely when that information is needed. Okay. It's really available across a tremendous amount of data sources. Replication is exactly what you expect. You're going to transfer data in. It could be in real time. It could be in a scheduled manner, right? So it's really going to depend on the use case, how frequent or fresh the data needs to be from an end user's perspective. And it's going to obviously depend on data volumes and how much data sort of is being accessed at any point in time. So you can sort of choose, and a customer has the capability to choose, the type of storage or access that happens from a Datasphere perspective. But again, this is something that is new to customers, in the SAP space and provides a lot more flexibility for non-SAP data sources. So I touched on knowledge graph, a bit earlier, okay? And the idea here in the context of data independence, it's how do we understand, the data that we're looking at? So if, as an example, IT has brought data in, okay, and I'm looking at that data, I may want to understand the relationship between the data, the metadata, the actual business process. That's going to help boost the effectiveness of machine learning or large language models. But more importantly, if you imagine from a business user's perspective, it's going to help them understand the data that they're looking at, the dependencies between the different data sets that exist, so that you can make more informed decisions about the specific data and data sets that you're looking at. So a relatively new addition to Datasphere as part of one of the latest releases. Knowledge Graph exists, and it is a cool tool from an end user or business user's perspective. That's really going to provide that semantic relationship. So something that otherwise would be, sort of row and column trying to look at information, it's presenting it in obviously a graphical format to understand those data structures and how the different elements of the data fits together. It'll sort of support that semantic layer that I talked about, the data relationship, the business context. I think what's most important is from a update perspective, it's also going to provide some context in the what if the underlying data structure changes? So what if we're bringing in new information? What if a business process underneath changes? What impact did that have or will that have on my data? Given the dependency of my data sources and how it fits together. So I think that this is a tremendous tool in giving users the ability to better understand that, as opposed to inheriting something and saying, well, now something is different or something's changed, and I don't know why. This is really going to give users access to better understand that information and what's changed in the information that they're specifically looking at. You can obviously see in the image on the screen, it's obviously a user-friendly interface. And the concept here is, make it easy. You don't need to have a technical background to understand this. You can look at this and really understand data elements and how those data elements interact with each other. When you sort of talk use cases, how do you leverage this, in a real world example? How does this make you more independent in your data pursuit? Data exploration. We can talk about this on its own, right? You can navigate those data relationships and explore the data, the impact analysis. So what we talked about in terms of underlying data changes and what impact that's going to have. But really, when you talk about process optimization, again, this is somewhere in an area that's not often talked about, but you can really analyze and sort of optimize processes by looking at inefficiencies. So where is something being shared in multiple places? Where is something unique? It'll provide a lot more visibility to users than any other system that they perhaps have used historically. All right. So data and business modeling, something again that is a little bit unique in terms of Datasphere versus traditional, SAP Business Warehouse. We've got a notion of two types of builders. At a real cursory high level, you've got data builder, and that's really going to be focused on data modeling, integration, data management. So really creating and updating data models, how they're structured, how the data is stored and accessed in Datasphere. So you can imagine that this is obviously more intended from an IT perspective. It's going to give the ability to look at data modeling. So how do you build those data models? Unlike Business Warehouse, we've got a graphical interface that can be leveraged. We can also leverage SQL coding, so it's going to give a lot more flexibility, and a lot more open skill set than what Business Warehouse would require. It's obviously focused on data connection and integration and data transformation and governance. So that's really the core. Let's get the data in the system. Let's get the data modeled and staged. But then there's this notion of business builder. And that's really where a business user, so in a more independent world, has the ability to look at those data models that have been created through data builder from a technical perspective, but actually leverage, that model using a semantic approach so that we've got a singular semantic layer, the same definition that applies across the board, across all of the data, but it's in a terminology and in a format that a data consumer will understand. So if I'm looking for, FI data, so my finance data, it's using terms that are familiar to me that I can understand, not the back-end terms and table names and field names that SAP uses behind the scenes. It's going to give flexible changes right to that data layer without impacting our end business users. And it's really going to hide that complexity. But the idea here is that a business user has the ability to come in, look at that data model that's been built and say, great, I like this. This is what I need, but I actually don't need all of these fields. I'm going to pare this down for my specific reporting need. And they can do that themselves through the business builder. Okay, it mitigates risk of, inaccurate results because we're all working from the same data set that's been built or brought into the system. So again, it's a move from SAP that you sort of haven't seen historically. Okay, and I think SAP has done a tremendous job here of recognizing that the reliance on IT is good, but there needs to be more from a self-service and independent data leveraging perspective. Okay, and that's where the business builder comes in, and that's where a business user has the capability to further refine the data set that they're looking at, enhance it, merge the data together, and then build reporting on top of it. Business Builder obviously is intended for our business users, so less IT centric. We see from a true governance perspective in some of our implementations that IT is still involved in aspects of Business Builder. Some areas it's not used. It's really just data builder. We build the models. Now let's build your reporting on top. But it does provide an additional layer here, for a bit more autonomy from an end user perspective. Okay, so spaces, something that we really haven't talked about yet, in the context of Datasphere. But there's a notion of spaces from an administrative perspective, space management. So, if you look at the diagram to the right, you'll sort of see here in this example, R&D, finance, marketing, sales, all set up as individual spaces in Datasphere. So you still have a single semantic layer that's sort of governing all of the data, but you're able to sort of parse the data, and segregate the data in a way that's going to make it relevant to the user. So if I am a finance person, the finance space is going to, primarily contain the data that I need. Not to say that sales data and that sales space, there couldn't be things that are important to me. It can be shared with me. I can collaborate with users to, access that information and use it. But the space management here is really going to give us the capability to define, a logical container that we're going to house that specific data in. Makes it easier for individuals to find what they're looking for. It makes it easier to sort of secure that data set and assign users access to a specific space. A lot of sort of benefit to this. And as you sort of get into the data builder that we just saw, it's all contained within these spaces as well, so that we're sort of earmarking, giving users access to spaces, and then leveraging that on a go-forward basis. But from a data independence perspective, you can imagine that this really honestly helps because I have access to, one space or two spaces that are applicable to me and what I'm looking for. It's going to further narrow the scope of all of the data sets, models, et cetera, that I'm looking for. Okay, so it's an easy way to sort of contain that information, really that we can isolate it and give sort of more role-based access that says, this is what I'm able to do within said space, and this is the data that I'm able to see within it as well. So it can be further and further refined. So you don't have to worry. You give somebody access to finance space that they're going to see information that isn't relevant to them. It can still be further refined within a space, but it really is a way to organize the data for users and have more sort of guardrails and control built around it. When we talk about those spaces, it is going to sort of weave into this notion around data elasticity and some of the data tiering capabilities. So the concept here is really that, you've got the ability as an administrator to sort of scale your compute and storage needs. So you're not tied to, a space and what's being used and saying this is what's, there forever. It can be tuned. It can be easily tuned from a administrator's perspective or a role-based security perspective, to determine. So if priorities are changing, you can increase or decrease the resources that are applied, and it's compute power and storage power that can be independently controlled. So you're talking live data, large volumes of data. You might want more compute power available, right, to make this obviously a more optimized experience for end users. So it's in blocks, but sort of gives you that ability. When you talk about data tiering, this is really where now we've got the ability not only to elasticize those spaces, but also have a data management strategy around how are we going to store the data, and characteristics that we may look at. How often is the data being accessed? So is this something that's being used all day, every day by your users, or is this something that's being used once a month, as an example, part of a month-end process? How frequent is the data updated? Is this data that's updated on a real time, excuse me, or a regular basis, or is this, like I said, once a month? What are the requirements that a user would expect from it? What's the type of data? Any other sort of considerations, and that's going to allow us to sort of determine whether we sort of want the notion of, hot, warm, cold. And that's really going to give us the ability to determine hot data. And you can sort of see in this diagram, on the right, we've got some cold storage, we've got some hot storage. Hot's really an active model, some real-time data connections, frequently updated data sets. Users want instantaneous reporting. We're obviously going to treat that differently. It's going to have more power around it. Warm data, maybe data that's aggregated, analyzed periodically, not so much on a real-time basis, less emphasis on it. And then cold data could be like archived data sets, things that we're not using on a regular basis at all, things that we're keeping for audit purposes, allows us really to control the power, that's contained around it, and the compute that we use for it. So that's all sort of tied into the space management, okay, in terms of the data that's being leveraged. Also going to control the amount of storage that we're allowing within any specific space. Datasphere is, you know, paid for in terms of consumption, so data that's flowing into the system being leveraged in the system. So you have the ability to control, how much data is allowed to be leveraged or consumed in any one single space. Okay, and last but not least, data governance. We've talked about it a few times. Data lineage falls into this bucket. Um, Governance is important in an SAP world. I know how important, data governance is, and practices around, data assets and managing those data assets through their life cycle. So the focus here really is centered around data quality, data integrity, security, but really allowing organizations to leverage data for strategic decision making, while still maintaining compliance. And that's a mouthful, but really the concept here is, how do we make sure that the data is accurate and correct? How do we follow the data from source, right to the analytic model that is being consumed from a reporting purpose? And this can be done through data lineage. So really, it's going to give us the ability to understand data flow from the fact table or the source that's being fed in, or source is, what joins, transformations, et cetera, are happening to the information, and where we're ultimately getting from a model that's being produced, right? What columns exist, what attributes are being brought in or inherited, what filters are being applied. So we've got a visual way of seeing this information, where this information flows, and ultimately the output of this information, even through an explorer view, just to analyze the data in a row and column structure to understand, is this the data that we're expecting to see? Is this the output that an end user would expect as the starting point for any of their reporting processes? So all of those concepts really tie in some capacity to self-service or data independence. And the idea here, obviously, is, how do we leverage the system, in this example, Datasphere, to really align with a user requirement and give users more access to data in a more timely fashion? So it sort of sparks the, how does it drive that independence? Obviously, that independence comes from understanding the data, having access through that business builder area to understand the data through the knowledge graph, through data lineage to sort of understand the relationships of my data and really align, to sort of put that out. What we often are asked, okay, and I included this slide here just simply because in an SAP world, we know that Business Warehouse or BW is obviously there, it's obviously in place, and a lot of customers want to ask the question, that's great, but if I wanted to move to Datasphere, how could I go about doing it? Okay, and there is a tool, BW Bridge, that sort of, if you sort of look at what's being inherited or brought across to Datasphere, everything from that data source connection, through your ADSO composite provider and out to query can be brought into Datasphere using BW Bridge. It'll create a space in your Datasphere tenant called BW Bridge, but it'll bring that model over. So you can imagine that this could be done in a gradual fashion, that you don't need to bring all of your assets over into Datasphere at once. Maybe there's a goal to decommission Business Warehouse at some point, and you want to sort of start dabbling in Datasphere. BW Bridge is a good start. Another opportunity would be to look at a new use case and evaluate, does it make sense to build this use case directly in Datasphere? Experiment with the system, understand it, and put something like SAP Analytics Cloud on top to do some reporting or analytics. There's a tremendous amount of opportunity here, and you can see on the left-hand side in a traditional business warehouse environment, there's a heavy reliance on IT, third-party ETL tools, data extracts, processes of, batch loading that users don't necessarily have, an end user doesn't really have insight into. They sort of see an end result. It's not easy to sort of run a reconciliation to make sure that all the systems and data is well aligned. So you can sort of see that on that BW side, data independence is very difficult to achieve. And it's difficult to achieve because, a business user, is not really a custodian of the data. In the Datasphere world, you have that ability. So it would exist, and it will help with driving openness, in growth. So if there are, machine learning algorithms or more data science that wants to be performed, it's an easier place to do it because you've got access and more openness around that data. That semantic model, I can't stress enough how important that is, really kind of giving a unified experience that a KPI is the same KPI across the organization because we're leveraging a standard semantic model in a business term. It really does reduce the risk from an end user perspective that they're not looking at an accurate, KPI or metric. It's going to help reduce risk from a self-service perspective. When we're talking about non-SAP data, we have the ability to see the same information and how that information comes in, and really a lower cost of ownership. Not a sales plug here, trying to get customers all to migrate to Datasphere, really just trying to call out that if there is a opportunity, there is a desire to sort of look at Datasphere, we can help in terms of opportunities really around migrating BW content or looking at use cases sort of to start leveraging Datasphere.
Sean, you had asked me for a 10-minute reminder. You got about 9 minutes left.
Perfect. It sort of leads me to the last slide that I have, and I've titled it, Where Do I Go Next? I'm open for questions. So if anybody has entered questions in the Q&A, happy to answer those before we wrap up.
Absolutely. There is one that's come in. It says, Hi, Sean. Since SAP has introduced premium outbound integration feature for charging customers for transferring data out of Datasphere to any non-SAP system like hyperscalers, how does this feature, how this feature is going to impact the customer's decision to use Datasphere for creating data fabric with SAP and non-SAP data. This charge can be huge for customers based on amount of data.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we're answering a lot, or educating customers a lot on lately, because SAP put a OSS note out very recently around taking data out of SAP, and sort of, from a compliance perspective, what that means. Those outbound replication flows. So if a customer wants to move this to a hyperscaler, or move SAP data to a hyperscaler, obviously a good pass through would be Datasphere. There is cost associated with this. I will say the value here and the value add is the business context, and that metadata relationship intact, so that you're not sort of pushing flat data out and trying to rebuild those connections in a hyperscaler, if that's ultimately where you're trying to send your data. But there really is a sort of conversation to be had here, and it is, what data are you passing through, and why are you passing it through right to a hyperscaler? Is there an opportunity that the data can live in data spheres? Is there an opportunity that perhaps you're not taking all of the data, you're looking at specific data for specific use cases, to leverage? Is it to blend with operational data that lives somewhere else? Maybe there's an opportunity that sort of tiered or gold data could be brought in and blended in Datasphere, so that you're not sort of paying the price for the outbound replication flow connection, but also getting the advantage of some of the Datasphere work. So I think it's a bigger conversation than just, it could be very expensive and why would I do it? It's really going to come down to business need. And what we're seeing is a lot less lately, in terms of customers saying we want to push all of our data out to a hyperscaler, and instead being a little more targeted about, here's the specific information and here's why we want to push it to Azure, or to AWS, and here's what we're doing with the data. And it comes back to a bit around my introduction, and around roadmap, and how we can help customers sort of build that plan. Always open to have those conversations, and provide some education around what options exist, and pros and cons. Excuse me, pros and cons of those options.
That's all the questions that have come in.
Okay. So in wrapping up, I'm going to go back to that statistic. 44% of organizations are not obtaining, or are, sorry, are obtaining value through their existing reporting and analytics. You can imagine, based on this conversation today, that this may be due to limited data understanding, data silos like we talked about, right? So we're talking about outbound to hyperscalers. There may be data silos that exist, lack of self-serve options. The concept here, and what I hope came through, is that Datasphere can support organizations in sort of developing a data strategy. Okay, and it's not to say that it has to be all Datasphere. Datasphere can live very effectively, with Microsoft Fabric, with Databricks, with Confluent. There are solutions out there, and rationales for where data lives and why, but there are ways for that data fabric to live and exist in a seamless fashion, so that a data consumer has easy access to the information that they need when they need it. Wherever you are in this journey, and I know most organizations are in a data journey in some capacity or some level, we're here to help. My contact information is on this slide. Feel free to reach out. There is also a generic SAP at Improving email address that will get routed to my team. So if you do have questions that follow on, or want to know more, by all means, feel free to reach out. Be happy to have those conversations.
Thank you, Sean, for that insightful look into the SAP's role in shaping the future of business technology. Your presentation has given us a deeper understanding of how these systems are evolving to support smarter and more efficient operations. As we continue to explore tomorrow technology today, I'd like to invite you to join us for our next talk, Agentic Workflows in Business, the Evolution of AI Chatbots. Boy, that word agentic is going to be a tough one. With Michael Slater, he's going to be sharing on November 11th at noon Central. Michael will delve into how the rise of retrieval augmented generation, that's RAG, is changing the landscape, making it easier to build AI systems, but also raising the bar in terms of innovation. He'll explore how businesses can leverage more advanced agentic workflows to enable chatbots that go beyond simple tasks to autonomously manage complex, multifunctional processes. We hope to see you there for another deep dive into how AI is transforming the future of work. Thank you again for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.